Happy Friday and welcome back to Drinking by Myself. We have so much leftover wine and Prosecco from New Year, so here I am still in New Year spirit drinking out of my fancy Prosecco glass. It is time for me to tell you my top 10 books I read in 2019. Actually, I think I cheated and made it 11, which you're gonna do. But what's interesting is, as a starting point, I went to my Goodreads and I just scrolled through all the ones that I gave 5 stars to. So you would think that all of those would be the ones in my favourite books of the year. But what was weird is that actually I found myself picking some of the 4-star books over them. So it kind of just shows how completely arbitrary ratings are, because I give my ratings on a purely like subjective basis. I'm not trying to be a professional book critic here. I can give a book that I thought was less well written a 5-star over a book that was more well written, but I didn't personally connect to it as much, because the rating is all about my own personal enjoyment. And so I often just give my ratings without thinking too hard about it immediately after I finish a book. But what sometimes happens is that months later I might give a book 4 stars, but then I look back on it and I have not been able to stop thinking about it. I have not been able to get it out of my mind. I'm recommending it to everyone. So then really, technically that should have been a 5-star. And it happens vice versa. I might give a book 5 stars, like, turn the final page, be like, wow, that was amazing, 5 stars. And then look back on it 6 months later and realise I can't remember anything about it, what it made me feel, what the storyline was, and so I'll then downgrade it to a 4 stars. So really the whole system is flawed and I should just stop doing ratings at all. So anyway, they're in no particular order. I did try to put them in order of how much I liked them, but it was just too impossible. I couldn't even pick a number 1. So in literally no order at all, just the order that I wrote them down on this list, let's go through my favourite books of 2019. So the first book I want to mention has been all over BookTube, and that was 3 Women by Lisa Taddeo. This was a non-fiction. It's rare. I actually have 2 non-fiction books on this list this year, and I don't read much non-fiction at all, and when I do, it's very rarely in my favourite books of the year. So that's wild. This one though completely reads like a fiction book. Like literally, if I didn't know it was non-fiction, I would just assume it was a novel because it's written as if it's a novel. So that might be why I liked this one so much. But it's basically just about 3 different women and exploring these women's sex lives and the relationship between their sex lives and their emotional lives and their inner lives, and it was just so moving. These 3 women have very different stories. There was a woman who had a relationship with a teacher when she was in high school, so he had essentially groomed her. She'd never told anyone about it until years later. She then decides to come forward and tell her story, and he completely denies it, and she has to go through a court case. We also have a story of a woman called Sloane, I think, who is this rather glamorous married woman, very beautiful, and she and her husband have a rather adventurous sex life where they like to invite third parties into the bedroom. And the wife, who we're hearing about, basically can't work out whether she's doing these things for her own desire or for her husband's desire. And then the third story was the one that actually like broke my heart the most. So this was about a woman who, when she was at school, she was raped. So she's carrying that trauma with her. She's now in a loveless marriage and she rekindles a relationship with her former high school boyfriend. But we just see the desperation that she feels to be loved by him, and that one absolutely broke me. The book was so well written. I will absolutely carry all 3 of these women in my heart with me for a long time. Then I've got The Farm by Joanne Ramos. So this is a dystopian book, but it's very, very sadly dystopian. It's about this centre, the Golden Oak Centre, where basically very wealthy clients pay surrogates to carry their babies for them. We slowly see quite how controlled these women are. Under hyper-capitalism, how much a company can own somebody's autonomy, with the women's autonomy, even owning like the babies themselves. It's all very, very creepy. And one of the main perspectives is a woman called Jane, who is one of the surrogates, and we see how she becomes increasingly helpless and increasingly trapped in this system. This is a book that I really want to read again. It's a book that I think would be a really good book club one because there's so much to discuss. I think I'll probably pick this next time I'm picking for my book club with my friends. This is kind of the Handmaid's Tale that we need for right now, because it's not set in this distant, far off, futuristic land. It is set right here, right now, and this is something that could happen any second now, and it's sort of a reflection of things that are happening right now. I thought it was really powerful. The next book is the one that probably, like, gun to my head if I had to pick, I would say was my favourite of the year. though that is a really hard choice, but that is Miracle Creek by Angie Kim. And I don't actually own a physical copy yet, which is wild because it was so brilliant. So this was a courtroom drama, which is interesting because I wouldn't have thought. I enjoy courtroom dramas, you know, I used to really like the Jodi Picoult books, but I wouldn't have guessed that one of them would be my favourite book of the year. But this was so emotional. So essentially, I don't even know where to start because there's so many different characters and so many equally powerful intersecting storylines going on. We start with this family, a Korean immigrant family who run an alternative medicine centre, which is essentially involves these big oxygen tanks which are supposed to cure all sorts of things, like autism. You know, if you can have a cure for autism, that's one of the things they claim to do. Infertility, I think, is one, you know, all sorts of things. There are people who protest against them because they think they're very dangerous. And right at the beginning there is an accident at this centre. One of the victims who died in this disaster was a young boy whose mother had been taking him there for autism treatment. And she is then accused of having deliberately sabotaged it in order to kill him. She was accused of not having been able to cope with looking after him and therefore having murdered him. The couple who run it are also, you know, being questioned about how safely they were running it, and we know there is some reason that they are lying, but we don't know exactly why. So it's really page-turning, really gripping because, you know, it's centered around this court case, and you want to find out what happened. You don't know who's guilty, who's innocent, why different people are lying. So that's what keeps you, you know, turning the pages, needing to find out what happened. But along the way, you are just diving into the hearts and souls of each of these characters, and you will care so deeply about everyone. Everyone has their story, everyone has their tragedy. It's absolutely fantastic, and I actually really want to read that one again too. Okay, then a book that I imagine is on a lot of these top 10 of the year videos, but Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. It would be incredible if you'd managed to avoid hearing anything about this book on BookTube, so I will be quick. It's essentially the transcript of a fictional interview with various members of this band, The Six, and other people who are associated with them, finding out what happened when The Six, at the height of their fame, joined up with the singer Daisy Jones, released this incredibly successful album, and then broke up and never reunited. So, you know, it's very much inspired by what happened to Fleetwood Mac, what happened to the Civil Wars. There's lots of real life inspiration that you can find in this, but it is so much fun to read. You really believe these people are real. I kept having to Google things just to see, was that bit real? Was that person real? And it's just not. She just invented this incredibly rich world, but it fits in so well with the rest of the kind of 70s music scene that you just believe it. When she talks about the process of their songwriting and them in the studio then putting these songs together, the whole process of producing a song is never something that I've particularly thought about before, but I cared so much about it. I was so fascinated that then the fact that you would then put down that chapter and not be able to go and listen to the song was almost like painful. I so want to hear this music. She like describes an album cover at one point and describes like the sexual tension that you can see between the band members on it, and I went and googled it because I was like, I have to see this picture. Like, she made it feel so real. That is the reason I think everyone is falling in love with these books so much. So I'm sorry that you must have seen this on so many top 10s and you've seen it on my channel alone like 100 times, but that is why. Another one that a lot of people have been talking about is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. So I read this one over the summer with my book club, and this one, it took me a little while to get into, partly because I was in a bit of a reading slump at the time anyway, and partly because it is very, very descriptive, and that's usually not my thing. Give it a try, because I did eventually get into it, and having started quite slowly, I was then absolutely hooked. So we have two kind of parallel timelines here. We have one that is going through the years starting from 1950s, with this young girl, Kaya, is essentially just abandoned one by her family and left to live. They live in this little shack, so she becomes, you know, people in the town call her the marsh girl, and she doesn't go to school and she doesn't wear shoes. Interspersed throughout that, we also get this timeline from 1969 when a very wealthy local man named Chase Andrews has been found dead, seemingly murdered, and Kaya, the marsh girl, is one of the suspects. And we don't know why she's a suspect, but as her timeline kind of travels towards 1969, we slowly find out how their lives intersected. And again, it's just so beautiful. It's another one that kind of centers, in part at least, around a courtroom, and that format, I guess, just does really work for me. It does really hook me, keeping on reading because you don't know actually whether or not she did it. So you're following the court case along with everybody else, and then all along the way it is still this incredible love story to nature, which it brings the natural world so to life. And I am not an outdoorsy kind of gal, but reading this you can't help but fall a little bit in love with the natural world. One that I read through script and don't have a physical copy yet is My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite, another one I'm sure you've heard mentioned. So this is a really snappy quick read. It's divided into these very short chapters, and it's about a girl whose younger sister is a serial killer. She keeps murdering her boyfriends, and she always says it's in self-defense, but her sister isn't really sure whether to believe her. And it all comes to a head when the younger sister starts dating the man that the older sister has been in love with for years, and she doesn't know what to do because she knows any man who dates her sister is going to get murdered. So she's torn between who to protect, this man that she's loved from afar for so long, or her sister who is terrible to her and completely just uses her and relies on her to like clean up the bodies of these men that she murders and become a kind of accessory to these crimes. But who is her sister? And ultimately that bond being the incredibly strong bond that it is. I have an absolute soft spot for books about sisters. I also have an absolute soft spot for books about serial killers. So this was pretty much my perfect combination. I wasn't expecting it to be so funny. It's really readable. I absolutely recommend it for one that's just a lot of fun and quite unexpected. One of the most just beautifully emotional books I read this year was Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. So this is a really quirky book about a time traveling cafe, basically. That's not quite how to explain it. So it's set in Tokyo, it's translated from Japanese, and it's about a cafe that has this magical power where if you sit in a certain seat, you have the power to travel back in time, but only to within the cafe. So you have to travel to meet somebody who has already visited the cafe, you have to remain in your seat the whole time, and you have to come back to the present before your coffee gets cold. There are a few more rules, it's all a little bit more complicated than that, but essentially it's just divided into like 4, I think, main stories, 4 main characters who come to the cafe for various reasons to travel in time. And then throughout it we also kind of fall in love with the characters who work in the cafe. They're very much part of the story as well. And it's just a delightful book. Each story, each reason why somebody wants to travel in time was really compelling, and like as the book goes on they get more and more emotional. I almost never cry at books. I almost never cry at films. I'm just not really a crier, but genuine tears came out of my eyes while reading this one, like happy tears, because I just loved it so much. It is sad, there are bits that are sad, but it was like the beautiful emotions of it that got me, really. A book that I've held on to for years before getting around to read, but now is one of my favourites of the year, so I definitely should have read it sooner, is TheReluctant Fundamentalist by Mohsin Hamid. So this one a lot of people were talking about when it first came out, which was like 12 years ago. It's again very short, very easily readable. It's all told as like one-sided dialogue. So it's set in Lahore, and a Pakistani man approaches an American man who's sitting in a cafe and starts to talk to him. And the whole book, what we're reading, is what this man is saying to the American man. It starts to get a little bit dark, like both in terms of it gets dark, but also the tone turns a little bit dark and a little bit sinister. You're not quite sure what's happening. And it's got this ambiguous ending that you can just approach from so many different angles. It's one of those books where you finish it and you just kind of put the book down and you just sit there and you're like, I just have to process this. I just have to think this through for an hour before I can even talk to another person. That's part of the point, is telling you like you need to stop trying to make judgments about people and trying to make assumptions about people based on this little information, because that's what causes all of these problems throughout the whole thing. This is a fantastic book, a really fantastic book. Okay, number 9 is my other non-fiction on this list. So this was The Adventures of Maud West, Lady Detective by Susannah Stapleton. I had so much fun with this book. So this is basically the story of Susannah Stapleton researching Maud West, who was one of London's leading lady detectives, but actually had this very mysterious life, because as well as being a private detective, she also wrote stories for like tabloids about her adventures as a private detective, but they're so outlandish that they can't possibly have been true, because anyway, she couldn't tell her true stories because that would kind of defeat the point of being like a secretive private detective. So Susannah Stapleton is trying to work out who the hell Maud West actually was, what's the truth of what she actually did. And it reads like a kind of Agatha Christie novel, because at the end of each chapter there's sort of a cliffhanger or a twist in Susannah Stapleton's research of it. She'll kind of discover something. So it's like reading a detective story in itself. It was so much fun. I had the absolute pleasure to interview Susannah Stapleton for Book Break, the channel that I run for work, so I'll link to that video. It was so much fun. She brought along all of these like mundane items, like pieces of fruit and stuff that Maud West would use to make disguises, and she had me like put like orange peel under my lip and figs in my cheeks to try and kind of put on a disguise, because Maud West was master of disguise. That's what's on the cover here, her various costumes. So go and watch that video. I laughed the whole way through doing it. And then go and read this book. It's just so much fun. And then finally, this is where I cheated, because my number 10 on this list, I actually just bought both books by the same author because I love them both. This is The Song of Achilles and Circe by Madeline Miller. These are both kind of ancient Greek retellings. So The Song of Achilles is telling the story of Achilles, obviously in the Trojan War, but it's a love story between him and Patroclus. This is the one that I read first of the two of them, and it broke my heart. So the romance between Achilles and Patroclus, I so believed them. I was with them there kind of every step of the way. It's this really intense, strong, powerful love, and the fact these two men have to go to this war, and Achilles kind of sucks. Like, I just after reading this read Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker, which is also incredible and paints Achilles in an even more terrible light. In that retelling, they're not lovers, and Achilles is absolutely awful. So in this book, you know, he still kind of sucks, but Patroclus is just so wonderful that because Patroclus loves Achilles, you kind of have to love Achilles. So this one absolutely broke me. I really loved it. And then Circe kind of lifted me back up again. This book was so empowering. So this tells the story of Circe, who I mostly only knew from the Odyssey, or entirely only knew from the Odyssey. She is the woman who lives on this island, and Odysseus and his men arrive there, and she turns his men into pigs, and he stays there with her on the island for a year or so. And she's actually only like a few pages in the Odyssey. And she actually is involved in so many other Greek stories. So for example, her sister is the mother of the Minotaur. She also is, I can't remember her connection to Jason and Medea. She's connected to so many stories. So you get this kind of twisted guide through all this Greek mythology, which I really loved. It was so much fun. And when I read this one, I'd been doing like a whole Greek mythology retelling binge, so I felt like I was so in that world. But it's basically about Circe like being banished to this island and nurturing her powers of witchcraft there on this island and becoming powerful and self-sufficient, and it's so feminist, it's so empowering. It, you know, doesn't quite make me want to go and live entirely alone on an island because I'd be super bored, but kind of made me want to go do that. So there you go, those are my favourite books of 2019. I absolutely loved reading everything on this list and so much more this year. So I definitely really want to hear what your favourite books of 2019 were. Do leave me a comment letting me know which ones I should read. Are there any from 2019 I missed that absolutely made your year? And do give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and hit that subscribe button below for new videos twice every week. Cheers!